But anyways. Okay, so the title of this one is Traditional Varsity Esports, How Varsity Esports Mimics Traditional Sports on the Path to Institutionalization. And as the subtitle suggests, we're going to talk about the case of varsity esports, in which there is evidence that the industry has been forming itself in a manner that is reflective of traditional varsity sports, for better or worse. What's important is that we pay attention to the way this new industry is built, as there's an opportunity to enact changes that could make esports into a reflection of a more progressive time. That is to correct the mistakes that have been institutionalized into pre-existing traditional sports models. The work that I'm going to present is a precursor to, or a proof of concept for, my thesis dissertation. The goal is to provide an interdisciplinary, but largely anchored in the field of game studies or institutionalism, and rather more tentatively within game production studies sort of project. And so before diving in, I'd like to give a quick summary of what is expected in this VOD. Firstly, I want to introduce an organization that represents what is arguably the leading form of varsity esports governance. Then I would like to explain how they are situated within my larger project on placemaking, and cover the progress of institutionalization, including the theoretical applications, implications, applications/implications that are drawn from my content analysis of media and industry documents. And then lastly, and hopefully in good time, I'm excited to share the vision for like my future academic inquiry into this space. Okay, so let's talk about the National Association of Collegiate Esports, otherwise known as NACE. According to their website, it was started in 2016 by 7 schools and has grown to encompass over 170 colleges and universities in the United States, Canada, and Guam. NACE carries out several functions, including governing rules and regulations, registering players and programs, and hosting tournaments and championships. However, it is not the only institution to carry out such functions. As varsity esports is in the early stages of development, there is also a diverse field of independent tournaments of various sizes and leagues, such as TESPA, TESPA, if you need to search it, Collegiate Star League, and Play Versus, including some sponsored by game developers such as Activision Blizzard and Epic Games. Within the larger scope of my thesis dissertation, I plan on exploring esports in terms of place, so describing the phenomenon as a transdigital assemblage based on the combination of Jenny Sundin's concept of transdigital affect and T.L. Taylor's explanation of gaming as an assemblage. The benefit of this is an expansive understanding of the phenomenon, which probes the assemblage and situates it amongst its material and immaterial constitutive elements. So placemaking is the process through which we gain a sense of place. Various notions of placemaking have been engaged with in Western and Indigenous scholarship, generally noting that places are dynamic and in a state of flux. My coinage of transdigital assemblage is intended to capture all of the elements that emerge in esports as a place. Here I'm inspired by John Durham Peters' Elemental Theory of Media, which you can check out in his book called The Marvelous Clouds. That's by John Durham Peters. When we think of esports as a place, the notion of a transdigital assemblage describes how it is constructed simultaneously in game world and in the physical world, thus considering everything from the material and immaterial, corporeal, technical, digital, and analog, as well as social and economic elements of the assemblage. So it kind of all emerges in one sense of place. And so one constitutive element of the assemblage, in the case of esports, and that we're going to explore here today, is the socioeconomic institutions that govern play. So those institutions in this case being NACE, or in terms of traditional sports, the NCAA. And they emerge in esports and bring placemaking power dynamics along with them into that sense of place. So the NCAA, for those who haven't heard of it, or maybe just know a little, is the National Collegiate Athletics Association. and they are best known by the TV broadcasts of their massive championship tournaments, such as March Madness, which is the college basketball tournament, or the college football playoffs. As you can see on the slide, it's an association of over 1,000 colleges and universities across the United States, and includes Simon Fraser University, the one university in Canada to compete under the association in Division II. Now, according to Knight et al., an academic source, it was formed at the behest of President Theodore Roosevelt in 1910, and that was in response to the violent nature of early college football. Shockingly, in the earliest days of the sport, it was actually common to have as many as 44 deaths in a single season. So now on to the research questions. My research questions are as follows. Number one, does NACE conduct institutional work? And if so, is it comparable to the NCAA? And number two, if NACE conducts institutional work, will they adapt more socially just institutions? The catalyst for this paper is actually an institutionalist study of the NCAA conducted in 2019 by Knight et al. They conducted a historic case study of the National Collegiate Athletic Association to determine how the 100-year-old sports governing body has remained dominant, which is relatively unique amongst institutionalized associations and governance structures. The result of their study is, and I quote, that findings suggest that the NCAA evolved its methods for controlling institutional boundaries, practices, and cognitions as a means for dominance, end quote. And so the goal of this paper was to determine whether NACE, which is the esports version, reflects Knight et al.'s findings. And so in an institutional sense, this refers to a more or less taken for granted repetitive social behavior that is underpinned by normative systems and cognitive understandings that give meaning to social exchange and thus enable self-reproducing social order. So I can use the word institution to mean these sort of quotidian social behaviors, or I could use the word institution to mean an organization that is infused with value. So there's the organizational sense of the word, and there's the behavioral sense of the word institution. And then by institutional work, I mean a purposive action that's carried out by individuals or collective actors to create, maintain, and disrupt institutions. And so those 3 points are key. The institutional work creates, maintains, or disrupts an institution. And an institution, once more, could be the taken for granted social behavior or the organization infused with value. And so to mimic Knight et al.'s methods, I chose to conduct a content analysis of a purposive sample of news articles mentioning NACE, as well as the previous 1 year's worth of NACE press releases and internal documents that were made publicly available on NACE's website. So in the summer of 2020, I coded for the 3 aggregate dimensions described by Knight et al., which are summarized on the slide right now. I've examined 42 documents in total. Of the 16 media articles and 23 press releases, there were 11 instances that provided the clearest examples of institutional work. So additionally, the NACE Constitution and bylaws, I didn't include it, but it spans all 3 categories. The 3 categories, once more, as you can see on the slide, are learning to control behaviors, practices, and cognition. So Knight et al. Provided examples of what these might entail. For controlling behaviors, the NCAA was found to build its membership structure, encompass rival organizations, and adjust its internal structures. Importantly, Knight et al. Actually emphasized that internal flexibility is a key behavior for institutions with minimal control in emerging fields. So as far as changing institutions go, in the behavioral sense, when an institution in the organizational sense is sort of new or in flux, those are the most flexible times to make changes to the taken for granted behaviors. So to highlight one instance of this with NACE, The first article that I included from ESPN, Article A, discusses NACE's partnership with the National Junior College Athletic Association, the NJCAA. And this is an excellent example of NACE learning to control boundaries, as it directly parallels the early NCAA's efforts to dominate governance of amateur athletics over their competitors, which for the NCAA was the Amateur Athletic Union back in the day. So essentially, what happened here is in learning how to control the borders of the sport, NACE essentially, by forming a partnership with the NJCAA, no longer has to compete with the NJCAA for governance of the sport as a whole. So through this partnership, NACE has been recognized, quote, as the governing body for esports at the collegiate level among all NJCAA members. Furthermore, as coverage in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal illustrate, NACE has been spared direct competition with the NCAA itself after the NCAA's board of directors chose not to bring esports under their umbrella due to its, quote, male-dominated player base and depictions of graphic violence, unquote, which were against NCAA bylaws. Now, next, when learning to control practices, the NCAA extended or strengthened regulations in areas such as technology, international competition, financials, misconduct, and gameplay. This was in the NCAA's sort of formative years. And so similar behavior was observed in NACE, press release C and D, in which they announced a series of partnerships that would, quote, support NACE in designing and building collegiate competitive gaming facilities, technology infrastructure, and audiovisual experiences across campuses for member schools looking to grow or establish a collegiate esports program, unquote, and to, quote, develop official physical build guidelines for varsity esports spaces, unquote. And interestingly, I just retweeted on Twitter Sean Burney, who's the program head at St. Clair College, where I did my ethnographic study on early Canadian varsity esports. This is St. Clair College in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, the first program in Canada. They have a brand new esports arena that's being built out, and construction has already started on that. So it's a great example of how St. Clair College, which is a NACE member, is building out their competitive gaming facilities. And so again, it's about learning how to control the practices within the industry of varsity esports. Another early example of a NACE organization doing just that. So lastly, by learning to control cognition, it was meant that the NCAA facilitated the legitimization of collegiate and amateur sports models, basically trying to clarify in the minds of the public and stakeholders the way that amateur and collegiate sports ought to work. That was the NCAA. And so in the esports version, by my observation, the clearest example of NACE doing this is found in in ESPN Article C and NACE Article E, which detail the outcomes and announcements of their annual national conferences. The NACE National Conference is actually coming up sort of towards the end of July. And so having a national conference like that is an example of NACE as an institution learning to control the way that esports is thought about. So lastly, the importance of conducting this research right now is that an organization's institutions are the most fluid in periods of change. As North American varsity esports are currently in their infancy, now is the time to identify, critically analyze, and adapt the institutions that programs are adopting from traditional sports in order to gain legitimacy. Additionally, we can assist governments, game producers, and governing bodies in drafting policies and adopting institutions, that's in the behavioral sense, that are more reflective of an inclusive and sustainable vision for sporting in the 21st century. Thinking of esports in terms of place, constructed as a transdigital assemblage, allows us to bring in all of these different elements to the game that all sort of arrive in that place. And so we're encouraged to identify and explore all of the constitutive elements that emerge. That could include like game production studies, broadcasting, the materiality of esports itself. So like the elements that are the rare earth elements that are required to be put into expensive gaming rigs that then need to be purchased and made available to players at tournaments, something like that. It could also include accessibility, equality, and diversity issues. So addressing the dearth of female gamers in just in games culture, but in esports especially. All of these things emerge in that place that is esports. And so that's the future sort of trajectory of my study, is to consider how these different elements emerge in that sense of place that evolves around esports. So thank you. This has been the first VOD for this channel. I expect to do more of these presentations as I come up with them while I continue through my PhD studies. If you are watching this, thank you so much. Really appreciative of it. You can find me on Twitter at Scholbs or here on Twitch. All of that information should be made available. So again, thank you so much. And I'm going to rejoin our raid now.